Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion, which you might be able to see behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So today is going to be a continuation of the plant review series. It's going to be for a plant that I don't have in front of me, but it will make sense throughout the video, and it's mainly because it's growing on my wall, in my conservatory wall, but on my wall nonetheless. So it's very, very difficult, A, to film next to it, or B, to move it, obviously. So without further ado, the plant that I'm going to be talking about today is going to be the Monstera dubia or the Monstera dubia. And if you are returning, welcome back. You know, as always, that there's going to be chapters down below, so if you want to skip to your favorite bit, you can. And if you are new, welcome to the slight insanity that is this series. But some ground rules first for the new people. These reviews are always going to be biased to my experience, because obviously I'm going to be talking about my plants that I care for in my conditions with the kind of care that I usually give my plants. So there's no two ways around that. I'm based in the UK. Most of my plants, specifically this one, is growing in my conservatory. And whatever that might mean in terms of grey weather, cold weather, warm weather, sunny weather, again, conservatory, even if it's in the UK, it gets blisteringly hot in here in the summer. But yeah, let's move on to the first topic. So coming into the background of this plant, and it's an interesting one because I purchased this, and I did purchase this, I want to say 3 years ago. Obviously the title will have, people that have been here for a while will know that I will go back on my plant care app and go, oh, when did I purchase this? Because too many plants to remember off the top of my head, but plant care app is the best cheat sheet that I've ever got. I know a couple of people have asked recently, I do try to link it on most of these review videos, but I will add a link up there for my kind of talk through of my plant care app, and there is a link on that same video to download that app. A little bit of a side note, I know a lot of people wanted to download it on iPhones and it wasn't available on iOS. It is now available on iOS, and I think it pretty much has all the same functionality that I would have on my Android. So there you go. But yeah, so I got this plant from a local seller, if I'm not mistaken, and I have got it linked down below. I think I do for most of my favorite sellers. They're in the descriptions of most of my videos, and it would be Sarah from Eastern Tropicals. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that's where I bought it from. If it wasn't Sarah from Eastern Tropicals, it would have been Kaylee Ellen and the Rare Plant Shop. It would have been one of those two. I cannot remember off the top of my head right now. But this plant wasn't a plant that was particularly difficult to find, but again, I'll touch on that on availability. And I got it, and it was kind of cool. I think it was growing on a very, very small plank at that point, potentially. I don't know if I got it just in a bag with some sphagnum moss. That might have been the case. But I will try and see if I can find a picture and add it here. The other bit that's interesting in terms of the background with this plant is that it's been split in two. And actually, now that I've said that, I remember that the first plant I got was from the Rare Plant store. The second plant that I got gifted as a one-leaf cutting was from Sarah at Eastern Tropicals when I bought a very large order of other plants, essentially. And both of those plants still exist in one form or another. And I will add clips so you can see the size of the pots. And I'm kind of looking at it now. It's on my conservatory wall. The people that have been here for the conservatory tour probably would have seen it at some point or another, but it is quite long. I would probably say about 2.5 meters long now, but I'll get onto how I've grown it in accessories and care section. But yeah, and I've got two of them as well. So one is very, very small. The other, I mean, they're both relatively long at this point, but you'll get what I mean by small in terms of pots when I insert a clip. And yeah, so they've both been growing relatively well. So coming on to speed of growth for this one, and it's a really interesting plant when it comes to the speed of growth because it does a few things. So I find that for me, the time when it really speeds up throughout the year is the transitional periods, and it might be because of how I'm growing it. And by transitional periods, I don't mean in the depths of winter or in the height of summer. I mean in the spring or autumn time. It generally tends to be where I get the best growth. Now, I would hazard a guess with this plant that it's to do with heat levels. So it doesn't like it to be too hot, and it doesn't like it to be too cold. So it's that happy medium. I can't control it that well in this conservatory. I do have an electric heater, and whatever that might mean with the energy crisis that we've got at the moment. Ah, such fun. So glad I recently got some solar panels, so at least it's it's not quite as bad as it could be, or not quite as bad as it was last year. But yeah, it's one of those things that it does like a very specific temperature. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I would imagine if it's a tropical, it would probably like to, in Celsius, remain between 20 and 25. And I think that's generally when I tend to get most of my growth, maybe 18 to 25 Celsius. And yeah, let me benchmark it as I usually do against something like a golden pothos in here. If a golden pothos during its peak, which I will assume for the golden pothos would be more of the summertime, it would bring out 2 or 3 leaves. This one probably would do the same. It's taken a bit of a beating, and it hasn't grown as well this year as it had last year. Last year it grew like a weed. I would probably say it was growing 3 to 4 leaves a month. It was insane. But there was a bit of an issue, and I will talk a bit more about that in terms of the care and what happened with mine to kind of slow down the growth a bit. So ease of propagation with this one, I would have to say, I mean, it's a Monstera, so it will be relatively easy to propagate. As long as you take a cutting and there's a couple of nodes on it. The tricky thing with this, and especially I found, was growing it on a wall, or if you're growing it on a plank or anything like that, that isn't technically sphagnum moss, you tend to get those kind of really strong and sturdy roots that attach to walls. They're a bit flatter, obviously. It's a shingling plant. And it is one that can be a bit tricky to get it going, but after you get it going, I find that it's a relatively sturdy plant in terms of propagation. Again, it's a Monstera, so they generally tend to propagate quite well. You obviously need to take your node cutting. I found that the best thing, if it's only got those types of roots which is attaching onto the wall, I would say probably in a propagation box with some damp sphagnum moss. This isn't one that you're necessarily ever going to want to do in water, and it's probably going to be because of the way that it's growing, because the only way you can sit it in water is to have a shallow puddle. Shout out to Emma and the alocasia shallow puddle method from Good Growing. But yeah, no, this isn't that basically, because I think if you would do that, it would probably rot out quite quickly. So damp sphagnum moss has worked well. You just want to keep the humidity high on this. Make sure that it's getting some decent light levels as well. And then something like perlite or pon, all of these things would work really well with this plant. I don't think I've ever propagated it in soil, but also because of the way that it's growing, I don't know whether or not that would necessarily work. The interesting thing with this plant, unlike a lot of other shingling plants, and I do have the Rhaphidophora cryptantha, and I will be doing a review on that plant as well at some point, is that one pretty much is on damp sphagnum moss on a pole, and that's how it's living its best life. The dubia, I find it does need a pot of soil, and I would imagine this is because of the way that it grows in nature, where it would have to attach to the ground first and then start shingling up the trees essentially. But yeah, and you can get different forms of this plant, and it's just to do with how it matures, but I'll talk about that a bit more in a later section. So moving on to availability for this one, and this is a really interesting, and I'll probably dive in a bit more in this section, because it isn't a plant that was ever exceptionally difficult to find, at least not here in the UK. I would assume Europe is about the same, and from what I'm understanding, maybe in the US and some certain other places of the world. Obviously, and you are all absolute legends for commenting as much as you are and having conversations in the comment down below these videos. I love to see that interaction between all of you. It's amazing. But yes, do comment down below how available it is in your area, basically. But yeah, it's not one that has ever got stupidly expensive. it's definitely come down in price. I think when I first bought it for like 2 or 3 leaves, it would have been on the higher double digit side of things. Not super high, but higher double digit side of things. I think at the moment, based on prices that I'm seeing quite a few years later, it's fallen a bit. It's not fallen a huge amount. I know I've seen a couple of sellers recently kind of selling it for a bit less. So you're looking at kind of mid to lower mid double digits, at least here in the UK. And again, it's not a plant that you'll see come up on the market very, very often. Now, my thoughts behind prices and availability for this one. So in terms of the price and the availability, I think those two are quite linked with this one. This isn't necessarily a plant that I think a lot of people want to desperately have, because I think the kind of blockage for most people when it comes to most shinglers is, I'm going to need to set this up somehow because I don't necessarily want it growing on my wall. And I'll talk about how I am growing it on my wall. But you can use things like a plank, and they're actually a lot easier because I had the same blockage in my head when I was doing this. And I was trying to figure out how am I going to do this, and I don't have the materials to sit there and cut wood and do all these things. And I do have a video on how I put my plants on planks, and I use cork tiles essentially that I get from Amazon. I cut it relatively easily. You don't need any specialist tools, and you can just let it grow on that, and it's relatively inexpensive as well. Yes, a lot of people did mention quite rightly so that at some point it will start deteriorating, the same way that a lot of wood would probably start deteriorating as well. And at that point, what you can do is either kind of attach another plank so you can grow higher, or see if you can kind of take it off to a certain point and then attach it onto a new corkboard plank essentially. But again, because they're relatively inexpensive and it's so easy for you to cut it and replace it, that at least takes off some of that kind of blockage there that you might have mentally as like, how am I going to care for this? So I think that plays a role, because if this was a plant that everybody wanted and it could grow relatively straightforward like a lot of other house plants or tropical plants might do, this would probably be a lot more desirable. Now, the forms of this plant is something else that kind of comes into play quite a bit, because the more juvenile leaves have got a slightly silvery kind of tint to the leaves, and it's probably blister variegation again, and I've talked about blister variegation on other videos as well. But that, and the leaves are quite small and they shingle up. It is the cutest thing in the world because they are little heart-shaped leaves. Now, the bigger it gets, it starts losing that silveriness. It starts becoming a bit more like a very long, mature epipremnum leaf without the splits or the fenestrations. It does fenestrate eventually. So yeah, when you see some people that are growing it, you'll see all the different stages of the leaves. I might be able to add some clips so you can see I've not reached full mature leaf stage, which is when the leaves get really, really huge. They start detaching from the wall or whatever you're growing it up against, and they've lost all the silveriness. They're a lot longer and larger. The leaf looks entirely different, and it will start having the fenestrations and the splits basically on the leaf, because it starts looking a bit more, it harkens more towards a traditional Monstera deliciosa at that point. And again, it makes sense because these plants are growing up a tree, and when they kind of reach the higher levels of the tree and they can get more light, that's where they can start detaching themselves a bit. Obviously, they're still attached throughout the whole trunk of the tree, and at that point they've got that support. They can start releasing from that trunk and opening up those leaves and getting those splits and those fenestrations so that the light can trickle down to the rest of the plant as well. But very, very interesting, and it does change so much morphologically. And again, I think this comes into play when it comes to availability, because some people are going to like the really mature leaves, some people are going to like the really juvenile leaves. The difference is, if you go for a mature leaf, you might get a couple of juvenile leaves if it kind of struggles and you need to start it off again. But generally speaking, you're there. You're at the mature leaf stage. With the more juvenile leaves, you can go through every transitional stage. If you don't want it to get those mature leaves, it's just going to be a case of you chop and you propagate all the time. When it starts getting the slightly more mature leaves, cut it. It will revert slightly back to a slightly more juvenile leaf, and then go from there. But I think that might be another reason why there's not a lot of demand for this. So it's not because it's necessarily a bad plant. It's just because I think people might struggle to get their heads around all these different aspects, which has also meant that it never became massively popular in terms of demand, so the prices never really got up. It is relatively easy to propagate, again, at least in my experience, so that obviously keeps some of the costs down. So yeah, I mean, this should be a plant that if you do enough research, and you don't even need to be doing that for a long period of time, you should come across one, and you should come across one at a price that you might be comfortable with. I mean, obviously the prices aren't going to ever be dirt cheap. They might become at some point, but, and I think that's the other thing as well. I think the prices isn't because the market is getting saturated with them and that's why they're dropping. They might just be dropping because the growers or the sellers are realizing that maybe this isn't a plant that a lot of people are searching for or that a lot of people want to spend a lot of money on. So not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that is kind of what it is, really. So pests with this one, and it's an interesting one because it's tricky sometimes to see the pest, especially if it's attached to something, because what you won't always be able to see unless you sit there and like try to lift every single leaf off whatever it is that it's growing on, you won't see if there's anything behind it. So I'm going to go through the list of all of this. Yes, I've had mealybugs on this. Yes, I've had whitefly on this. Yes, I've had spider mites on this. Yes, I've had thrips on this. Literally everything. And to be fair, that holds true with most monsteras. Most monsteras can get most of the big types of pests. Obviously, for the people that have been here for a while, they know I never really talk about scale, touch wood, because I have never had scale, and I don't know how prevalent scale, the scale insect, is in the UK. I see a lot of people in the US talking about it. I know definitely in the UK from talking to different people, we get a lot of mealybugs on a regular basis, but I don't think I've ever seen anybody talk about scale. I might be wrong, correct me, but at least in my experience, I've never experienced scale. So yeah, it will get most of these types of pests. Do they ever go rampant and do they go out of control really quickly as long as you've kind of caught it and treated it? Not really. It's Yes, it's had some whitefly. Yes, it's had some mealybugs. But again, none of this became a huge pest pressure, at least with my plants. And obviously, the caveat here is that I am growing it in a conservatory, so the humidity levels can remain quite high for a long period of time, which probably helps a bit with that. But I would be really interested to know if you're growing this somewhere that doesn't have very high humidity levels, are you finding that it's more pest prone? I know that some people might try growing this in a terrarium. I would almost say that the Rhaphidophora cryptantha is a better one to grow in a terrarium because it stays a lot more compact, at least it has been in my experience. And yes, there will be a review for that one coming up soon. But this one wants to get bigger. It's a Monstera. And I think a lot of people, unless you've got a massive terrarium or a plant cabinet that you can kind of let it take over the whole thing, you're going to struggle at some point because it will grow quite rapidly at some point and it does get bigger. So keeping it in a relatively small and enclosed terrarium might be a bit tricky. Coming on to accessories. Now this is a bit that I really wanted to dive in a bit more, and again, hopefully throughout the video I would have interspersed clips so you can see what this plant is like when it's growing on my wall. So for the people that have been asking, and again, the people that have seen the conservatory tour would have probably seen this, and I have got a list, a playlist, that's the word, not just a list, a playlist with some of my conservatory tour videos, and I will add it at the top there so you can go and see that if you wanted to. But essentially what I've done with this is I've grown it on a wall, so it's on a brick wall. It's really tricky to try to explain this. So the conservatory is attached to the side of the house. The side of the house has got exposed red brick, and that's what the wall that this plant is growing on is like, essentially. So I knew with a lot of Monsteras, actually arguably now that I've seen the dubia grow a bit more, I don't know if I would have necessarily needed it. But I know with a lot of Monsteras and friends of mine that have grown them against things, I'm talking about the Monstera deliciosa specifically, their roots are substantial and they can do some structural damage to buildings and walls. These roots for this shingling plant are really never going to be that substantial. At least they haven't been in my experience. But what I did do in order to safeguard against that, because I've got the Monstera dubia growing, and right in front of it, it was next to it, now it's in front of it, and it's still okay. That might also hearken as to why it's slowed down its growth a bit, because it's getting less light. I've got a Philodendron Monstera on there, and it's causing a bit of shade and it's growing over it. But they both seem to be surviving quite nicely. And you would imagine in nature as well, there will be other plants competing for that same space up the tree trunk. It wouldn't just be the Monstera dubia. So it's replicating a bit more of its natural habitat and how it might potentially be growing there. Now, with that, I did put, I think it's called a pond liner. So it's a very kind of thick plastic material that's relatively waterproof, and I've attached that to the wall. I will say, in the beginning, until it starts bushing up and covering it entirely, it can be quite unsightly, because it looks like a really thick black bin bag type of material. So it's not the best thing in the world. However, it does safeguard the wall behind it. I also find, because it's plastic and because it's meant for ponds, and it's this weird texture to it as well, it's not entirely smooth, it's better at retaining some of that kind of ambient humidity that's in the space, which I find that helps this plant root out a bit easier than if it was just on plain brick. Because the brick, obviously, to a certain point, wouldn't be quite as the humidity levels and the moisture, I'm not explaining this very well, wouldn't stick to it that well. So that has helped. The other bit that I was going to say with this is I've only ever grown it in terracotta pots or net pots, and it's always been in my arrowed soil mix. I wouldn't try this anything else, because it can be quite specific on where it wants its kind of soil roots to be. But, and hopefully I would have inserted a video here so you can see the pots are tiny in relation to the plants. So one pot was probably this big, and this is the big plant. The other one is a titchy little pot. But the plant is huge at coming off it, so it just needs something to root in. The other thing I will say, at least in my experience, is it doesn't tend to absorb that much water from the soil. So out of a lot of my Monstera, this is one that will either get watered really, really infrequently, and I say this generally in the winter, but in the summer, I almost have to water those plants again because they're such small pots, every 2 or 3 days. And this comes up to another bit of a struggle with this plant, which is if you've got it attached to a wall and you've got it in a small pot, it makes it really difficult. You're having to maneuver a very tight space if you want to repot the soil section of it without ripping it entirely off the wall. Does that make sense? Because if it's attached and the pot's down below, how are you going to take it off and move it around so you can put the new soil and put the new pot? So that might be another challenge that people are having. Obviously, something like pest control is something that you might want to do. I've never had predatory mites on it, so I would imagine that would potentially work. It'd be tricky on how you would hang it. But other than that, and then the other thing that I was talking about at the very beginning of the video, I've had to chop this back because it hit the ceiling of my conservatory, and it's where the kind of the roof meets the wall, and that's wood, unfortunately. And yes, finally, I think the new conservatory is going to get ordered at some point. Stay tuned, it's probably going to be in the next few months, hopefully, that I might get it done. Anybody who lives in the UK knows how time-consuming, or not time-consuming, how long it can be until you get anything, either like replacing glass or windows or conservatories in the UK. But yeah, this was going under the wooden beams of the roof and going through. So I'm not entirely sure if it actually managed to get all the way through to the outside, which I would imagine I wasn't too fussed about that, because essentially what it would do was that would start dying of cold damage. I was keeping an eye on the internal plant, because if that would happen, that might cause an issue further down on the plant, but it was fine. I had to cut it off, and I've kind of maneuvered it to kind of go aside. The other thing that you're going to need to do with this, and hopefully again some of the videos you might be able to see, and I do apologize for how janky it might look, but I've put something like sellotape just to attach it when it's drying to root out onto that sheet, into that membrane, essentially that pond membrane, because it tends to want to lift off. So if you kind of make sure that you're kind of sellotaping it so it's flush against it for 2, 3, 4 nodes until it finally gets the hint and starts rooting, after that it will do it on its own, but you need to kind of guide it along a bit, essentially. But yes, coming into final thoughts of this, and this video might be slightly longer than some of the other ones, but it's because it's a bit more of an intricate plant. And I will start with the usual question that I ask myself is, knowing what I know now, and if I didn't have this plant, would I purchase this plant? Probably. So, and again, this might harken back to maybe why this plant, the availability aspects of this. It's not a straightforward plant. You really want to be aware of what you're doing. It's not a straightforward plant because it's not like every other plant that we might be growing. This is a very different plant because if you've never had a shingler, this is a shingler, it will do its thing. I will say if you're going to try going into shinglers, this might be a good one to start off with. This one I found out of a lot of the shinglers is the most forgiving in my opinion. But yeah, because of all that faff and you need to attach it to the wall and all these things, that's why it's a maybe. The reason why it's not a flat out no is because it's quite pretty actually, and it's quite a different plant, and it is a bit of a showstopper. If you do get it on a wall or something that it really does kind of like latch on, even if you're growing it on plank or wood, or if you're growing it on the cork boards that I was talking about, it can be quite a different and interesting plant. And it's one that a lot of people, if they come into your house and they see it, they're just like, oh, what is that? That's kind of cool. So there is that element to it. But yeah, that's why you see me with the maybe. It's not that I don't enjoy the plant. And this is kind of bringing me into the next question that I usually ask myself, from usually from 0 to 1 being the worst score that I can give it, to 10 being the best score that I would give this. I would still give this a solid 7 or an 8 on a good day, basically. And on a good day, I mean, is if I finally get it to get those big mature leaves, then yeah, I'll be happy, because I like the different leaf stages, but I like all of them actually. So, and I know sometimes you can get the more mature leaves, cuttings with the more mature leaves, so you get that fuller look a bit more, and that only recently in the last year or so has started coming onto the market. I would love to get my hands on one of those, especially if it doesn't necessarily require a plank to grow on, at least for the majority of its life, so it can be a bit more of a sprawling plant. Yes, but yeah, I mean, it's a good score, it's a good plant, but I get why this isn't as popular. There's a lot of kind of, not difficulties, but things that you need to consider, things that you need to do that you might not be used to doing, basically. But it's because of the way that this plant might grow. And this is kind of very true about the fact that this is a plant that morphologically wouldn't necessarily grow like all the other plants that we're kind of used to, because of how it's adapted to its own natural environment. And do I think this is a plant that somebody who's just starting off and they want to go from a standard house plant to this first? I would probably say no. Don't bite my head off with this, but I would say maybe get a couple of the other ones that are slightly tricky and then move on to this. It's not because it's a tricky plant. You just really need to want to get this to do well in order for it to do well. I don't know if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. But yeah, I think I've prattled on for quite a bit. Obviously, if you've got this plant and you want to share your experiences, they might be entirely different to mine, and I completely get it. I think this is a bit of a weird and kooky one, but meh. Do share them down below. I'd love to hear them, and I'm sure other people would as well, especially if they're looking to get this. I think more education is needed for this plant so that people go into it with eyes open, rather than what I was getting when I was first looking into this plant, where everybody said, it's beautiful, and it was just after people had just bought it and there was a couple of leaves, and yeah, it's exciting and it's interesting, like any plant would be. But I think the realities of growing this plant is something that needs to be spoken about as well. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.